The bustling streets of Edo pulsed with the fleeting beauty of cherry blossoms, their delicate petals drifting like pink snowflakes onto the cobbled paths where the young samurai apprentice walked, his geta clattering in a rhythm that mirrored the restless beat of his heart. The air was thick with the scent of roasted sweet potatoes and miso broth from nearby stalls, mingling with the faint, woody aroma of freshly cut cedar from the dojo. He had just left a place where the tatami mats always smelled of sun and straw, where the hiss of a drawn katana was as sharp as the cold steel itself. He paused beneath a gnarled cherry tree, its branches heavy with blossoms, and watched as a single petal spiraled down to land on the silk of his sleeve. Its fragility a stark contrast to the weight of the sword at his hip. The world around him teemed with life merchants hawking wares, children laughing as they chased petals, the distant toll of a temple bell. Yet he felt untethered, caught between the unyielding legacy of his ancestors and the gnawing doubt that coiled in his chest like a restless serpent. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his katana, the smooth lacquer cool against his clammy palm, as if the weapon itself could anchor him to the path his father had carved with blood and honor. But the more he sought mastery, the more he wondered if he was worthy of the name he bore, if the stillness he craved in meditation, the crisp bitterness of matcha lingering on his tongue after morning practice, would ever quiet the storm within. The breeze shifted, carrying the whisper of falling petals, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined they spoke in the voice of his late grandfather. A true samurai finds strength not in the absence of fear, but in the discipline to move with it. The sun dipped lower, painting the wooden facades of Edo in gold, and as he exhaled a slow, deliberate breath, the weight on his shoulders lightened just enough to take another step forward. The blossoms would fade, as all things did, but the resolve he sought might yet bloom in their wake. The dojo was silent save for the whisper of wind through the shoji screens, carrying the earthy scent of freshly woven tatami mats mingled with the sharp, clean aroma of matcha that lingered in the air. Takeshi knelt in seiza, the smooth, polished wood beneath his knees cool against his skin, his spine straight as the ancestral blade resting atop the stand before him. The flicker of candlelight danced along the katana's length, casting fleeting shadows like the doubts that coiled in his chest. His fingers twitched just once as he inhaled, slow and deliberate, the rhythm of his breath a fragile counterpoint to the pounding of his heart. Outside, the distant clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed like the footsteps of generations before him, each one a reminder of the weight he carried. His father's face flashed in his mind. Stern, unyielding, the lines of his brow etched with the expectations of a lineage that stretched back to the age of the gods. A samurai's worth is measured not by his victories, but by the honor he upholds, he had said, his voice as unshakable as the mountains. Yet here, in the stillness, Takeshi's hands felt too small, too weak to bear the heft of such a legacy. The silk of his hakama rustled as he shifted, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet, and he caught the faintest metallic whisper, the blade's subtle sigh as it settled in its sheath, as if even the steel questioned his readiness. He closed his eyes, letting the bitterness of the tea still on his tongue ground him. And for a moment, the world narrowed to the rise and fall of his ribs, the way the morning light seeped gold through the paper walls like the first brushstrokes of dawn across a scroll. In that breath, he imagined himself not as a boy clinging to the past, but as the river beyond the dojo's gates, constant, flowing, carving its path through stone with quiet persistence. The discord in his mind stilled, if only for a heartbeat, and in the space between doubt and duty, he glimpsed the faintest promise of peace. Not in the absence of fear, but in the mastery of it. The morning air was crisp, with the faint herbal scent of sun-warmed tatami mats as Takeshi knelt in the dim stillness of the dojo, sweat cooling along his spine. His palms rested lightly on his thighs, the rough weave of his hakama brushing against calloused fingertips. Beyond the open shoji screens, cherry blossoms trembled in the breeze, their petals scattering like flakes of rust, a reminder of his father's sword. Still unbloodied in his hands after 3 years of training, the memory coiled in his gut like a snake. His father's voice, brittle with disappointment, recounting generations of warriors who had borne their katana with unshakable certainty. The weight of that legacy pressed upon him with every breath, every flicker of doubt that mirrored in the polished floorboards, where his own reflection seemed to waver like a specter. Even now, his fingers twitched toward the hilt at his side, as if the blade might whisper some secret he had yet to earn. The sound of steel sliding from silk echoed through the dojo, a whisper so fine it seemed to sever the very air, and Takeshi's spine straightened as his master settled beside him. Silent as the first frost, the old man placed a lump of raw Tamahagane steel between them, its rough surface drinking in the pale light. The alloy was cold against Takeshi's fingertips when he reached for it, yet beneath the dull crust, he imagined the latent fire, the same buried fervor that had haunted him through sleepless nights. "A sword is not shaped by the hammer alone," his master murmured, pouring bitter matcha into a chipped cup, the steam curling like temple incense. "The metal must learn its own strength." Takeshi watched the tea leaves swirl, their dance recalling the river behind his childhood home, where he'd once traced kanji into the wet sand characters washed away before anyone could read them. His exhale trembled as he lifted the steel, the uneven weight straining his wrist. The forge awaited, its charcoal scent sharp with promise, but his body resisted, muscles locking as if bracing against an unseen blow. The gods of the kiln would demand perfection. The ancestors would judge the temper of his spirit. He closed his eyes, envisioning the blade, yet unborn its curve, a replication of the harvest moon, its edge honed by the same winds that shaped the pines outside. When he finally stepped forward, his geta clattered against the stones like a faltering heartbeat. Each strike of the hammer would be a question. Could he fold patience into the metal? Could he marry discipline to desire? The master's gaze followed him, heavy as a shrine bell. But for the first time, Takeshi did not flinch beneath its toll. Heat bloomed before him, and in the wavering air, the steel began to glow, a forge fire sunrise, a baptism of sparks rising like the souls of all the warriors who had come before. His doubts would burn with the impurities. What remained would be pure. What remained would be his. The forge breathed like a living thing, its heat pressing against Takeshi's skin as he stepped across the threshold. The scent of iron and charcoal thick in the air, mingling with the faint, earthy aroma of damp stone. Beneath his geta, the cobbles were uneven, worn smooth by generations of apprentices who had come, as he did now, to witness the birth of a blade. The blacksmith moved with deliberate grace, his hands gnarled and scarred gripping the tongs as he turned the glowing steel in the fire, the coals pulsing like a heartbeat. Takeshi exhaled slowly, the bitter aftertaste of morning tea still on his tongue, and let his fingertips brush the hilt of his own katana, its polished wood smooth against his calloused skin. The smith glanced up, his eyes sharp as flint, and spoke without preamble. A blade is a mirror. It reflects the soul of its maker, clean or clouded, steady or trembling. The words settled heavily in Takeshi's chest, a weight as tangible as the ancestral sword his father had entrusted to him, its edge honed by generations of duty. Outside, the wind whispered through the bamboo, a sound like drawn steel, and for a fleeting moment he wondered if the gods themselves were testing him. His fingers tightened around the hilt, the silk wrap damp with sweat, and he thought of his father's face, stern and unyielding as the cliffs of their homeland, and his mother's voice, soft but insistent. Honor is not in the sword, but in the hand that wields it. The forge's glow flickered across the smith's face, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits, and Takeshi's breath hitched. Was his own soul so uncertain, so frayed at the edges? He recalled the mornings spent in the dojo, the taut silence before the first strike, the way the tatami mats smelled of straw and sun, the way his own reflection in the training sword had seemed a stranger's. The smith dunked the red-hot blade into the water with a hiss, steam rising in a curl like incense. And Takeshi closed his eyes, imagining himself as that steel hammered, folded, tempered. Could he too be remade? The rhythmic clang of the smith's hammer began anew, each strike an echo of the temple bell at dawn, calling him back to the present. He bowed deeply, the motion steady despite the tremor in his hands. And as he straightened, the first light of afternoon spilled through the open door, gilding the dust motes that swirled like sakura petals caught in a breeze. The katana at his side felt lighter now, or perhaps it was his own spirit, shifting ever so slightly toward something like peace. The young samurai apprentice knelt in the dim light of the smithy, the scent of tatami mats, and the faint, earthy aroma of freshly steeped green tea lingering in the air. a small comfort against the weight pressing upon him. His fingers traced the raw steel before him, cool and unyielding, its surface catching the flicker of the forge's embers like distant stars. The choice of metal was not merely practical, it was sacred, a decision that would shape not just a blade, but his very legacy. His father's words echoed in his mind, a relentless whisper. A samurai's sword is his soul, and his soul must be without flaw. The pressure coiled in his chest, tightening with each breath as if daring him to falter. He hesitated, the tremor in his hands betraying the storm within, doubts that cut deeper than any blade. Was he worthy of this steel? Of the name he carried? The forge's heat pulsed against his skin, a living thing, as though the spirits of his ancestors watched from the flames, their judgment heavier than the anvil before him. With deliberate slowness, he lifted the steel, feeling its heft not just in his palms, but in his spirit. The metal was unkind to hesitation. It demanded certainty, demanded mastery. The rhythmic clatter of Geta sandals outside, the distant murmur of the town waking, all faded into the background as he exhaled, long and steady, surrendering to the ritual. The first strike of the hammer against metal resonated through the space, sharp and clear as temple bells at dawn. Each blow was a prayer, a plea for clarity not just in the steel's grain, but in his own heart. The forge's glow outlined his movements, casting long shadows that danced like the ghosts of samurai past, their whispers woven into the wind that slipped through the bamboo slats of the smithy. Sweat traced a slow path down his temple as he worked, the scent of charred oak and hot iron filling his lungs, grounding him in the moment. His focus narrowed to the metal's transformation, the way it yielded and hardened beneath his hands, just as his own resolve would have to. A memory flickered his mother's voice, softer than his father's, reminding him that even the cherry blossom must endure winter's bite to bloom. The bitterness of the green tea he had taken earlier still clung to his tongue, a reminder of the discipline required for sweetness to follow. The blade began to take shape, its edge emerging like the first light breaking over the mountains, gradual, inevitable. His breath grew measured, falling into the rhythm of the work, each movement a meditation in motion. The cool touch of water hissed as he tempered the steel, steam rising like the mists that shrouded the temple gardens at dawn, where he often sought solace. For a fleeting moment, the noise in his mind stilled. There was only the blade, only the act of creation. And in that stillness, he glimpsed the peace he had chased, the same quietude that came when kneeling before the family shrine, the scent of sandalwood and old paper mingling with the silence. By the time he set the unfinished blade aside, his muscles ached, but his spirit felt lighter, as though the doubts had been hammered out with each strike. The morning sun now slanted through the open door, painting the floor in gold, and the distant caw of a crow carried on the breeze like an omen, or perhaps an acknowledgement. The steel was not yet a sword, just as he was not yet a master, but both were on the path. And for now, that was enough. The forge roared like a restless spirit, its flames licking hungrily at the shadows as the young samurai apprentice lifted the hammer once more. The heat pressed against his skin, thick with the scent of burning charcoal and molten metal, while the rhythmic clang of steel against steel echoed through the workshop like the distant tolling of a temple bell. Sweat traced a slow path down his brow, stinging his eyes, but he did not blink. His focus was absolute, even as his hands trembled slightly with exhaustion. Each strike was a confession, a silent plea to the gods of blade and fire. Am I worthy? The iron glowed crimson, pulsing like the heartbeat of some great beast, its light flickering across his calloused palms, and the faded crest of his family's kamen stitched onto his sweat-damp robe. He remembered his father's voice, stern as temple scripture. A samurai's sword is his soul, and the weight of those words pressed heavier than the hammer in his grip. The fire crackled, spitting embers like stars falling to earth, and for a moment he saw not the forge, but the stillness of his family's dojo, the crisp scent of tatami mats steeped in pine oil, the whisper of silk as his knees met the floor in seiza, the way dawn light spilled through shoji screens, painting the world in gold and shadow. There, in those quiet hours, he had once traced the edge of his katana with reverent fingers, the blade's cold kiss a reminder of both legacy and burden. Now, as he shaped raw steel into something greater, he wondered if he too could be reforged, if the doubts gnawing at his ribs like rust could be burned away in this sacred fire. A breeze slipped through the open shutters, carrying the damp chill of approaching rain and the faint, earthy aroma of matcha from the tea house down the street. It mingled with the metallic tang of the forge, a dissonance as sharp as the conflict in his chest. He paused, letting the hammer hover midair, and inhaled deeply, as his master had taught him. Breathe with the earth, not against it. The momentary stillness was a meditation, the distant clatter of geta on cobblestones, the creak of bamboo bending under the wind, the way the fire's glow wavered just so across the blade, revealing imperfections only a devoted eye could see. His master's words returned to him then, soft yet unyielding as the river-worn stones in the temple garden. A sword mirrors its maker. To perfect the blade, first perfect the self. The apprentice closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the hammer, the give of the metal, the heat that could purify or destroy. Was this not the path of the samurai? To endure, to refine, to rise again and again like the sun over the battlefield, relentless in its duty. The fire hissed as he quenched the blade, steam erupting in a silver cloud. And for the first time that evening, his breath steadied. The scent of rain grew stronger, whispering of renewal, of the world enduring beyond the smolder of his doubts. When he raised the finished sword, its edge caught the dying light, a fleeting, perfect clarity. And in that moment, he understood. Honor was not a stone to carry, but a river to join, flowing endlessly toward the sea. The forge's embers dimmed, their anger spent, and the night exhaled around him. Somewhere beyond the workshop walls, a monk's bell tolled, its resonance humming through the air like a prayer. The apprentice set the blade aside and knelt, pressing his palms to the warm wood of the floor. The furnace's heat still clung to his skin, but beneath it, quieter now, was the cool, certain peace of a man who had faced the fire and not turned away. As the red-hot steel hissed under the smith's hammer, Takeshi knelt on the sun-warmed tatami of the forge's anteroom. The clean scent of woven straw and bitter green tea curling around him like a silent companion. His fingers traced the edge of the unfinished katana resting before him, the steel still rough, unpolished, yet humming with potential. And he remembered his father's voice, low and unyielding as winter earth. A blade is shaped not by force, but by patience. A single strike out of anger will spoil the temper. The words coiled in his chest, heavy as the humidity clinging to the afternoon air. Beyond the open shoji, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets marked the passage of townsfolk, their lives untouched by the weight of legacy. While here, in the dim glow of the forge, Takeshi's palms grew damp against his thighs. The blade was a reflection of himself, unyielding in form, yet flawed in the making. His breaths came shallow until he forced them deeper, mimicking the measured cadence of his morning meditations, where the scrape of his sheathed katana against silk obi was the only sound in the stillness before dawn. Even now, he could taste the memory of iron and ash on his tongue, the way his knees ached after hours of seiza, the flicker of lantern light gilding the scroll of his ancestors' calligraphy. Honor is not carried, it is forged. The smith's hammer fell again, a resonant clang that seemed to shake the very beams of the ceiling, and Takeshi's gaze fixed on the steel's uneven edge, a flaw his father would have dismissed without hesitation. His stomach clenched. Was this how the gods saw him? A boy playing at being a samurai, his spirit as untempered as the blade before him. A cicada's drone pulsed through the open window, the sound rising and falling like the tide against the cliffs of his homeland, where the sea had worn stone smooth over centuries. Discipline, his sensei had said, is the quiet hand that shapes chaos into grace. Takeshi exhaled slowly, watching as a shaft of sunlight pierced the smoke-heavy air, illuminating the motes of dust that drifted like ghosts between worlds. The smith paused, wiping his brow with a forearm, his hands scarred and leathery gripping the tongs with the reverence of a priest tending an altar. For a heartbeat, Takeshi envied the simplicity of such labor heat, steel, purpose, until the man's eyes met his, dark and knowing. "Steel remembers," the smith murmured, turning the blade to the light. "Every strike, every hesitation, it bears the marks of the hand that shaped it." Takeshi's fingers twitched, the phantom weight of his own katana against his palm, its grip worn smooth by generations. He thought of the cherry blossoms in the temple courtyard, how their petals fell without regret, each one a fleeting lesson in surrender. Perhaps mastery was not in becoming unbreakable, but in learning to bend without shattering. The smith resumed his work. The hammers song a steady heartbeat. And as Takeshi closed his eyes, he imagined the blade cooling in the river's embrace, its veins of Damascus pattern rising like the whispers of long-dead warriors. His father's voice came again, softer now. A true sword does not fear the fire. The scent of charcoal and oiled metal thickened, and somewhere beyond the walls, a breeze stirred the wind chimes, their hollow tones blending with the distant chant of monks. Takeshi touched the unfinished katana once more, its surface still rough against his fingertips, yet humming, waiting. The path to peace, he realized, was not in the absence of doubt, but in the forging of it. The forge's heat clung to Takeshi's skin, even as the evening coolness seeped through the open shoji, carrying the crisp scent of cedar and damp earth from the garden outside. The rhythmic clink-clink of his hammer had faltered moments ago, his arms freezing mid-swing as the lamplight caught it, a hairline fracture, spiderwebbing through the folded steel. A betrayal in the heart of the blade. His breath hitched, the taste of bitter green tea still lingering on his tongue from the break he'd taken, though it did nothing to soothe the tightness in his chest. The flaw was tiny, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but to him, it screamed like a war horn. His father's voice, stern and unyielding as the cliffs of their ancestral lands, coiled in his mind. A samurai's worth is measured by his blade. His blade is measured by his patience. The tea bowl on the low table beside him reflected his face streaked with soot, eyes shadowed by exhaustion. He'd spent weeks folding, hammering, quenching, each layer of steel a prayer to the gods of craft, each strike a plea for the strength to prove himself. Now the work threatened to unravel. His fingers trembled as he traced the fissure, the polished metal cool and accusing under his calloused touch. Outside, the wind stirred the bamboo grove, their hollow stalks clicking like disapproving teeth. The choice loomed like the edge of a cliff. To start anew would mean another month of sleepless nights, his master's silent disappointment, the whispers of the other apprentices. Yet to press on to ignore the flaw would be to bury weakness beneath the surface, a dishonor not just to his name, but to the very spirit of the steel. He closed his eyes, the scent of charcoal and oil thick in his nostrils, and let himself sink into the memory of his first meditation beneath the old maple in the temple courtyard. The monks had taught him to listen to the spaces between his breaths, to find the stillness beneath the storm of his thoughts. Now he sought it again, exhaling slowly as the distant chime of a temple bell floated through the air. The blade was more than metal. It was a living thing, shaped by fire and will, as flawed and striving as he was. The crack was not failure, it was a question. Could he bend without breaking? The lamp flickered as a moth brushed against its paper shade, casting wavering shadows across the worn tatami. Takeshi reached for the tongs, the iron warm from the forge's residual heat, and hesitated. In that pause, the world narrowed. The creak of the floorboards under his knees, the metallic tang of the air, the way the light caught the faintest ripple in the steel, like a river's current frozen in time. His ancestors had forged swords that had carved history. His own hands felt clumsy in comparison. But then another breath, deeper this time. He remembered the way cherry blossoms fell without resentment, even as their brilliance faded. Perfection was not the absence of flaw, but the harmony of intention and acceptance. With a steady hand, he returned the blade to the coals, watching as the flaw glowed red, then orange, then vanished into the fire's embrace. He would fold it again, not in defiance of the mistake, but in reverence to it. The steel would remember, and so would he. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, their quiet patter on the stones a reminder. Even the sharpest blades were tempered by water. The young samurai knelt in the dim quiet of the practice hall, the scent of fresh tatami mats, and the faint, earthy bitterness of green tea lingering in the air. Outside, the first light of dawn seeped through the shoji screens, casting long shadows that stretched like the weight of his thoughts. His fingers brushed the smooth, lacquered saya of his katana, the wood cool and familiar beneath his touch. But as he drew the blade with the quietest whisper of steel, his hand betrayed him a tremor, slight but unmistakable. The shame of it coiled in his chest, tight as the tension in his shoulders. His father's voice echoed in his mind, stern and unyielding. A samurai's hand must be as steady as his spirit. Yet the more he sought perfection, the more elusive it became, like mist slipping through his grasp. The weight of his family's legacy pressed down, heavier than armor, and he wondered, not for the first time, if he would ever be worthy of the name he bore. Around him, the hall held its breath, the faint rustle of silk against his hakama, the distant murmur of a monk's chant from the temple beyond. The way the dust motes danced in the pale light, indifferent to his struggle. He closed his eyes and exhaled, long and slow, letting the air leave his lungs until there was nothing left. Then, deeper still, he inhaled through the nose, as his master had taught him, drawing in the stillness of the morning, the faint woody aroma of the floorboards, the metallic tang of the blade before him. The act itself was simple, yet the peace it promised felt like a distant shore. Memories flickered. His father's disappointed gaze when he faltered in sparring, the way the villagers bowed too deeply to his family's crest, their deference a reminder of what he owed them all. But beneath that fainter were other memories, the way his mother had once smiled as she poured tea, saying even the cherry blossom must fall to grow anew. Or the mornings when the mist clung to the mountains like a benediction, softening the edges of the world. His fingers tightened around the tsuka, not in frustration, but in acceptance. There would always be tremors. There would always be doubt. Like the uneven cobbles of the training yard beneath his geta, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, perfection was not absence of flaw, but the honing of it. The sword was not just steel. It was the patience of the forge, the rhythm of the river that cooled it, the countless hands that had wielded it before. To carry, it was to join that lineage not as a master, but as a student of the world. The clatter of wooden practice swords drifted in from the courtyard, a staccato rhythm like rainfall against stone. And for a moment, he imagined himself among those forgotten warriors, their struggles long dissolved into history, their worth measured not by single strokes, but by the sum of their devotion. He rose, sliding the katana home with a quiet click. The weight of it at his hip was no longer a burden but a compass, pointing him toward the next breath, the next step, the next cut. The path of the sword was endless, but so too was the sky above the dojo vast, uncharted, forgiving. He would never be perfect, but he would continue. The breeze stirred, carrying the scent of pine and distant incense, and as he stepped into the light, the shadows at his back seemed less like ghosts and more like guides. The katana lay across his lap, its curved blade catching the sparse morning light that filtered through the shoji screens. The scent of fresh tatami, sun-warmed straw, and clean earth mingled with the faint, bitter aroma of matcha still lingering on his tongue from the morning ritual. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of wooden geta on cobbled streets echoed, like time itself counting down, a reminder of the world moving ever forward while he sat suspended in this quiet chamber of his soul. His fingers traced the blade's length, skin registering the cool, unyielding steel, smooth as a river stone worn by centuries of patiently flowing water. Each deliberate stroke of the whetstone was a whisper against the edge, a harmony of friction and precision, the sound so faint it might have been the breath of the gods themselves. He exhaled, slow and measured, matching the rhythm of his task. Yet beneath the discipline, his pulse betrayed him a tremor in his wrist, slight but undeniable, like the first quiver of a leaf before the storm. His father's words coiled in his mind, heavy as the ancestral armor displayed in their hall. A samurai's worth is measured by the sharpness of his blade and the stillness of his spirit. But the blade was easier to hone than the soul. Doubt clung to him like the humidity of midsummer, thick and restless. What if his hands, though calloused from years of training, were never steady enough? What if his heart, though fierce with devotion, was never calm enough? The whetstone circled again, grain whispering against steel, a ritual older than the temples that dotted the hills beyond the city. He imagined the countless warriors before him who had done the same, hands moving in silent conversation with the metal, as though polishing not just a weapon, but the very essence of Bushido itself. The blade was more than steel. It was the frontier between honor and disgrace, between his family's legacy and his own inadequacy. A bead of sweat traced his temple, though the morning was cool. He paused, fingers curling against the tsuka, the silk wrap familiar as his own breath. Somewhere beyond the walls, a temple bell tolled, deep and resonant, shaking the air like the voice of the mountain spirits. It was a sound that had marked the turning of the ages through war and peace, through generations of hands just like his, gripping swords just like this one. The blade caught the light once more, and in its reflection, he saw not just his own face, but the faces of his ancestors, their gazes as unflinching as the edge he sought to perfect. He inhaled sharply, the air crisp with the faint tang of pine from the courtyard, and forced his shoulders to loosen. The doubts would come, they always did. But so would the rhythm, the scrape of stone, the pull of breath, the quiet certainty that with every stroke, he was not just shaping the blade, but being shaped in turn. The morning stretched on, the light shifting lazily across the floor, painting the dark wood with gold. Somewhere, a sparrow trilled, a fleeting note of wildness in this ordered world of discipline and reverence. He lifted the blade, turning it to inspect his work. The edge gleamed, not with the cold arrogance of a weapon, but with the quiet humility of a tool tempered by patience, by reverence, by the endless cycle of striving and surrender. For the first time that morning, his fingers did not shake. The weight of expectation was still there, but so was something else, something like stillness, like the heart of a river beneath its rushing surface. He sheathed the katana with a soft click, the sound final yet not an ending but a vow. Today, like every day, he would rise, he would falter, and he would try again. The blade was polished, the meditation was just beginning. Takeshi knelt on the sun-warmed tatami, the clean scent of straw mingling with the faint, earthy aroma of freshly whisked matcha. His hands, still smelling of polishing oil and sharpened steel, trembled slightly as he laid the katana before his master, the blade's curve flawless. The hamon, a whispering river of fire caught in folded metal. The room was hushed, the only sounds the distant call of a crow outside and the almost imperceptible sigh of silk as Master Hitoshi shifted. Takeshi's breath stilled as the older man took the sword, the shink of steel leaving lacquered wood sharp as a split thread. The weight of generations pressed down on Takeshi's shoulders, his father's unyielding gaze, the scrolls of ancestors lining their home, their names heavy with victories he feared he'd never earn. Yet in this suspended moment, there was only the glide of Master Hitoshi's fingers along the tsuka, the balanced pivot of the blade testing the air like a heron's wing. Approval came not in words, but in the slow, measured nod, the way the light caught the master's eyes' dark pools reflecting not just the sword, but the years of pre-dawn drills, the calluses earned on stone-sharpening wheels, the silent tears swallowed behind the tea house after yet another bruising spar. The bitter taste of matcha lingered on Takeshi's tongue, a mirror to the ache in his ribs where doubts nested like winter sparrows. Yet, as the sword returned to his hands, his fingertips traced the same grooves forged by fire and water, and something unknotted in his chest maybe. This was enough. The cobbled path outside echoed with the karan-koran of Geta, a rhythm as constant as the turning seasons, as the gods who watched through the rustling pines. Master Hitoshi sipped his tea, steam curling like temple incense, and Takeshi exhaled, the tremor in his hands stilling. The sword wasn't just steel. It was the silence between heartbeats, the space where honor and fear met, where a single breath could be the difference between a cut and a killing stroke. Perhaps peace wasn't the absence of weight, but the strength to carry it. Beneath the ancient cherry tree, its gnarled branches heavy with blossoms, Takeshi knelt upon the tatami mat. The scent of fresh straw and polished wood mingling with the faint bitterness of matcha still lingering on his tongue. The petals fell in slow, silent spirals, grazing his shoulders like the whisper of ancestral ghosts. He inhaled deeply dew-kissed air, the distant charcoal smoke from morning hearths, the earthy perfume of moss between the cobblestones where his geta had clattered just moments before. The weight of his katana lay against his thigh, its scabbard cool and smooth beneath his fingertips, the blade within humming with restrained energy, as though echoing the tremor in his own pulse. A single petal caught midair, trembling like the doubt coiled beneath his ribs. Honor is not given but forged, his father's voice echoed, harsh as the scrape of sword metal. Yet the more he trained, the more his hands betrayed him. Even now, his left thumb twitched against the Seigyo cord, raw from yesterday's drills, his knuckles remembering the sting of the master's bamboo rod when his stance had faltered. He closed his eyes, forcing his breath to sync with the rustle of leaves overhead, the rhythm steady as a monk's chant. The world narrowed, sharpened. A bee droned past, wings brushing his ear. A bead of sweat traced his spine, though the dawn air was crisp. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a cart creaked, laden with rice sacks, but here, beneath the blossoms, time stretched thin as rice paper. The petals pooled around him like pink snow, each fall a silent lesson. This is how a thing returns to earth without struggle. His chest ached. Would his ancestors watch him too, as they watched these petals, their judgment as soft and inevitable as decay? Or would they turn away, ashamed of how his blade wavered in sparring, how his knees unlocked under the weight of their name? A breeze stirred the branches, scattering blossoms in a sudden flurry. One caught in his half-tied hair, clinging as though pleading. For an instant, he saw his mother's hands, deft as birds, tucking a sprig of plum blossoms behind his ear before his first duel. "Fear is the shadow of greatness," she'd murmured, her smile warmer than the hearth. His fingers tightened around the katana's tsuka, not in tension, but in recognition. The steel was an extension of his soul, flawed yet capable of mirroring clarity, just as the temple pond mirrored the drifting petals. He exhaled, long and slow, imagining his doubts dissolving like ink in water, dark tendrils dispersing, until only stillness remained. The cherry tree sighed above him, its roots knotted deep into the bones of the land, older than the shogunate, older than the gods. It would bloom and shed and bloom again, indifferent to the trembling of one boy's heart. And yet, in its indifference, there was mercy. Takeshi bent forward, forehead nearly touching the mat, the silk of his hakama whispering against the tatami. For this breath, this petal, this fleeting moment cradled between earth and sky, he was enough. The scent of fresh tatami mingled with the earthy bitterness of matcha, grounding the young samurai apprentice as he knelt in the dim light of the dojo. Outside, the first crickets of evening whispered to the fading sun, their song a fragile counterpoint to the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets beyond the screen doors. His fingers trembled slightly as they traced the smooth, cool lacquer of his sheathed katana, a motion he'd repeated 1,000 times. Yet tonight, it felt different. The blade's weight against his palm was more than steel. It was the weight of generations, of his father's unyielding gaze, of the scrolls in their family's altar that bore names like unattainable stars. Could my hands ever be worthy of this? The doubt coiled in his chest like smoke, thicker with each breath. Yet when he slid the blade free, the whisper of steel against wood was so sharp it seemed to cut the air itself, a sound so pure it quieted. For a moment, the storm within, the edge caught the candlelight, not as a weapon meant to draw blood, but as liquid silver, a mirror to his own unsettled spirit. He remembered his master's words. The sword is the soul. Crooked the blade, crooked the heart. His reflection flickered in the polished steel, warped yet striving toward clarity. A moth brushed against the lantern, casting fleeting shadows over the calligraphy scroll on the wall, endurance, in bold, unbroken strokes. He exhaled, slow and intentional, as if the air itself could carry away his fears. The bitterness of the tea still lingered on his tongue, a reminder of life's unspoken trials, yet there was comfort in its austerity, in the way its heat matched the fire in his belly. Outside, the wind stirred the cherry blossoms. Their petals fell like silent witnesses to time's passage. How many ancestors had sat exactly here, their own doubts pressed into the same polished floorboards? The thought humbled him. His fingers tightened around the tsuka, the silk binding soft yet unyielding against his grip, like the discipline he sought to cultivate. In the stillness, he began the kata, each movement a prayer heel pivoting on worn wood, the weightless pause before a strike, the blade's arc tracing the same path as the crescent moon now rising beyond the eaves. His muscles remembered what his heart often forgot. That mastery was not the absence of fear, but the will to move through it. The sword became an extension of his breath, its tip flicking upward like a heron taking flight, its descent as inevitable as autumn leaves meeting earth. This is not destruction, he realized, but harmony. The steel was his unsettled spirit given form, shaped like the river polishes stone by every patient stroke of the whetstone, every hour of meditation under the unblinking gaze of the Buddha in the corner alcove. As he sheathed the blade, the click of the tsuba meeting the scabbard resonated like a closing gate. The candle had burned lower, the shadows deepened. Yet for the first time, The weight at his hip felt lighter. Honor was not a mantle to be seized, but a path to be walked one step, one strike, one breath at a time. The blade was no longer just his family's legacy. It was his own unruly heart, tempered and gleaming, the scent of fresh tatami mats and steaming green tea wove through the quiet dojo as the young samurai knelt on the polished wooden floor, his fingertips tracing the smooth silk of his hakama. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets echoed like a distant heartbeat, while the morning sun seeped through the shoji screens, casting golden veins across the dim space. He exhaled slowly, the bitter taste of tea still lingering on his tongue. Yet his hands betrayed him a faint tremor as he lifted the katana, the blade whispering free of its sheath, with a sound like a single drop of water falling into oblivion. His father's arrival was announced only by the shift of air, the scent of sandalwood grounding the moment, yet the weight of expectation settled heavier than armor. The man stood framed in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the floor, and for a heartbeat, the apprentice saw not the stern lord who had raised him, but the faint lines of weariness around his eyes, the way his own hands, once bound by the same invisible chains, rested with deliberate stillness. The gods do not measure a warrior by the sword alone, his father said, voice low as wind through bamboo, and knelt beside him. The cobbled path of his words carried the weight of generations. How the cherry blossoms, fleeting in their brilliance, still rooted deep. How the moon, though scarred, pulled the tides without hesitation. The hearth's embers cracked softly between them, and in the silence, the apprentice remembered the countless mornings his father had risen before dawn, the way his breath had fogged the winter air as if in prayer. The older man's fingers brushed the katana's hilt, not to correct, but to share its weight. Even the finest steel bends before it holds its edge, he murmured. Outside, a sparrow alighted on the stone lantern, its wings a flutter of shadows here, then gone. The apprentice closed his eyes, feeling the heat of the teacup seep into his palms like forgiveness. The doubt, he realized, was not a weakness, but the space between one breath and the next, where the soul could stretch toward the light. In the stillness, the dojo breathed with them, the woven reeds of the mats sighing under their knees, the blades of their swords humming silent songs of fire and patience. For the first time, the weight felt holy. The soft rustle of silk against tatami filled the quiet room as the young samurai knelt, the clean scent of fresh straw mats mingling with the earthy aroma of matcha. His calloused fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the chowan dark, and elegant in his grip, feeling the warmth seep through the smooth glaze into his palms. The older master across from him moved with the precision of falling snow, whisking the bitter green powder into a pale froth. Each stroke echoed the rhythm of their shared breaths, though the apprentices came unevenly beneath the weight of his father's unspoken scrutiny. He glanced at the katana resting beside his knee, its silk-wrapped hilt catching the thin morning light honor made manifest, yet heavy as the scrolls of lineage that lined the alcove's shadows. The first sip burned his tongue, a deliberate bitterness, like the sting of memories. His boyhood fingers slipping on a practice bakken, the whisper of disappointed elders weaving through the dojo's wooden beams. Yet here, in the hush of sunlit steam rising between them, the ritual unfolded like the turning pages of their shared history, centuries of men who had lifted this same bowl, knelt on these same mats, their doubts swallowed and transformed. The master's knuckles, weathered as ancient pine bark, paused mid-pour. A single droplet trembled on the lacquered rim, clinging as stubbornly as the boy's fear that he might never bridge the distance between the warrior's path and the quietude of his own wavering heart. Outside, the wind stirred cherry blossoms against the shoji screen, their petals brushing the paper like the ghosts of battles, past reminders that even the mightiest swords had once been molten ore, shaped by fire and patience. The old man exhaled, slow as a tide retreating, and in that silence, the apprentice finally tasted it. Not just tea, but the fleeting tang of iron on his younger lips after his first sparring victory, warmth of amber sunset on his father's rare approving shoulder squeeze, the clatter of a distant water basin in the garden measured the moment, each note ringing clear as temple bells calling monks to kneel not in submission, but in recognition of something vast and timeless. His fingers stilled against the bowl's curve. For now, the swords could wait. The evening air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant smoke as Takeshi stepped onto the worn cobblestones leading to the dojo, his geta clattering softly like the steady heartbeat of the earth beneath him. The lanterns flickered, their golden glow pooling on the polished wooden steps, and as he slid the door open, the familiar musk of tatami and waxed cedar wrapped around him like an old friend. Inside, the stillness was profound, broken only by the faint rustle of silk as he knelt, the deliberate click of his katana resting against the floor, a sound sharp as winter's first frost. His fingers lingered on the scabbard, tracing the lacquer's cool smoothness, a tactile reminder of generations before him who had borne this blade, their expectations weighing heavier than the steel itself. The tea beside him steamed, its bitter aroma curling into the air, and as he lifted the cup, his breath fogged the rim, mirroring the haze in his mind. Hours earlier, his hands had trembled during drills, his cuts uneven, the phantom whispers of his father's disapproval louder than the clash of practiced swords. But now, in the shrine-like silence of the dojo, even his pulse seemed to slow, syncing with the rhythm of the swaying pines outside. He exhaled, long and deliberate, as if expelling the doubt coiled in his chest like a stubborn knot. The lamplight caught the edge of his blade as he drew it, the whisper of steel against wood a testament to patience, to the 1,000 repetitions that had carved his calluses as surely as rivers carve stone. His reflection shimmered in the polished metal, not the face of a hesitant boy, but one etched with the quiet resolve of the mountains at dawn. Outside, a lone cicada sang its twilight hymn, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined the kami of the forge watching from the shadows, their approval humming in the blade's unwavering edge. He had come here night after night, chasing mastery like a monk seeks enlightenment, one breath, one strike, one sip of bitter tea at a time. The path ahead was no longer a burden, but a bridge between past and future, between duty and self, between the clatter of earthly strife and the silence beyond. With measured grace, he sheathed the katana, its muted click a seal upon his newfound peace. And the dojo, the trees, the very stars overhead seemed to murmur in reply. The cherry blossoms whispered once more, their petals trembling like fragile hands in the breeze as they scattered across the courtyard, painting the stones in fleeting pink. Kenshin knelt on the sun-warmed tatami, the clean scent of woven straw mingling with the sharp, earthy bitterness of freshly whisked matcha. Each breath steadied him, though his fingers still betrayed a tremor against the lacquered tea bowl. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets echoed the heartbeat of the city, a reminder of the world moving ever forward, while here, in the hushed stillness of the dojo, time stretched thin as silk. The katana beside him caught the light, its blade a sliver of moon against the dusk, and when he lifted it, the whisper of steel against Seijio was so faint it might have been the wind sighing through the pines of his ancestors' graves. He exhaled, slow, measured, yet the weight of his name clung to him like the damp spring air. Every strike of his sword, every stroke of his calligraphy bore the specter of his father's unyielding gaze. The generations of warriors who had carried their legacy without faltering. What honor was there in a heart that doubted? The question coiled in his chest, sharp as the tanto at his belt. Memories surfaced. His first duel, the way his opponent's blade had grazed his ribs, not with malice, but with the cruel mercy of exposure he had won. Yet the applause rang hollow in his ears, for he alone had felt the hesitation in his wrists, the split-second fear that had almost cost him everything. Now, as the last petals spiraled downward, he watched one catch against the rippling surface of the stone basin, floating like a wounded crane on still water. The monks spoke of sakura as transient souls, their beauty a lesson in surrender, but Kenshin wondered if their true teaching lay deeper, in the way they bloomed not for praise, but because the roots demanded it, because the silent pull of the earth and sky left no other choice. His thumb brushed the tsuka of his sword, the polished wood cool and certain beneath his touch. Perhaps mastery was not in never stumbling, but in the grace of the recovery, not in the absence of fear, but in the breath taken before the strike. The blossoms settled, the tea cooled, and as the lanterns flickered to life along the streets, their glow washing the eaves in gold, Kenshin closed his eyes. For the first time, the noise within him stilled, and in that silence he heard it not the clamor of expectation, but the quiet, unshakable truth. The sword and the soul were one, and the journey, endless as the seasons, was the only destination that mattered. The dojo was silent save for the faint rustle of the morning breeze slipping through the bamboo blinds, carrying with it the clean, earthy scent of tatami mats woven tight with straw. Mingling with the sharp, grassy aroma of freshly whisked matcha, Takeshi knelt at the head of the room, the smooth, cool wood of the floor pressing into his knees, his posture erect but not rigid, a balance he had spent years perfecting. Beside him, the younger apprentice Kenji mirrored his stance, though Takeshi could see the slight tremble in his hands, the nervous flutter of his breath so familiar, so like his own when he had first knelt here. A boy drowning in his father's shadow. The katana lay between them, its lacquered sheath gleaming faintly in the soft light, so dark it seemed to drink in the dawn. When Takeshi lifted it, the blade whispered free with a sound like winter ice splitting on a lake, a breath of steel that always made the back of his neck prickle. Kenji's eyes widened, his lips parting just slightly, and Takeshi remembered his own first time holding a blade, how the weight had felt both alien and inevitable, like the burdens of his name. He exhaled slowly, the bitter taste of tea still lingering on his tongue, and turned the blade so the edge caught the light, a single, flawless line. This, he thought, is what they never tell you. Not just the cuts and parries, not just the rituals and forms, but the quiet, the stillness between strokes, the way the world narrowed to the space between heartbeats, where doubt and duty could not follow. He had spent years chasing his father's ghost, his own hands never quite steady enough, his strikes never quite true. Until the day his master had placed a cup of tea before him and said, "The sword is not in your hand, it is in your breath." Now he watched Kenji's fingers twitch, the way his shoulders tightened, saw himself, restless and desperate to prove something he hadn't yet understood. Outside, the distant clatter of wooden geta on cobblestones echoed like the steady pulse of time itself, a rhythm older than the dojo, older than the pines that creaked in the wind beyond the walls. Takeshi shifted his grip on the hilt, the silk wrappings rough against his palm, and mirrored the movement for Kenji, slow and deliberate. "Feel the blade," he murmured, "as you would feel the air before rain." The boy hesitated, then reached out, fingertips brushing the cool metal. Takeshi remembered the monks at the temple near his childhood home, chanting, as dawn painted the stone steps gold, how they had spoken of the gods in the spaces between things, in the pause before action. "A sword is not just steel," he said, voice low. "It is the river that shaped it, the fire that forged it, the hand that wields it. And when you hold it, you hold all of them with you." Kenji's brow furrowed, but his grip steadied, his breath deepening. Takeshi felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he carried. In the silence of the dojo, with the scent of tea and wood and the faintest hint of incense from the shrine in the corner, he understood, suddenly, why his master had never hurried him. Mastery was not a thing to be seized, but a path to be walked step by step, breath by breath, until the weight of expectation and the ache of doubt grew lighter, until they became part of the rhythm, like the cicadas humming in the trees or the distant toll of the temple bell. This, he thought as Kenji slowly raised the blade, his movements still clumsy but earnest, is how we honor them. Not with perfection, but with patience. Not with fear, but with presence. And for the first time in years, Takeshi felt the stillness within him, unshaken, like the heart of a storm. As night fell over Edo, the city's clamor softened into a tranquil hum, the distant cry of a merchant closing shop, the rhythmic clip of wooden geta on cobblestones fading like the last notes of a shamisen song. The young samurai knelt in the dimly lit dojo, fingertips brushing the tightly woven tatami, its clean, grassy scent mingling with the sharp, earthy aroma of freshly whisked matcha. A single lantern cast trembling shadows across the wooden floor, the light catching the gleam of his katana resting on its stand, its curved blade whispering of centuries of duty and bloodshed. He exhaled slowly, the air cool against his lips, and reached for the sword. His fingers hesitated, trembling ever so slightly, as if the weapon weighed not in steel, but in generations of expectation. The shhhk of the blade leaving its sheath was barely audible, yet it echoed in his bones, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. His reflection shimmered in the polished metal, distorted yet undeniable. His father's stern brow, his grandfather's unyielding gaze, the legacy of warriors who had worn their honor like armor. The weight of their eyes pressed upon him, heavier than the sword itself. Would they see his doubts as weakness? The question coiled in his chest like smoke. Each breath carried its sting. Outside, a breeze stirred the cherry blossoms. Petals clung to the shoji screen, their fleeting beauty a whispered reminder of the impermanence he could not afford. He tightened his grip, the silk cord of the hilt smooth against his calloused palm, and closed his eyes. In the darkness, memories surfaced. His father's silence after a clumsy strike in sparring, the way his mother's fingers had paused mid-stitch when he spoke of his fatigue, the relentless murmur of the other apprentices unworthy, unprepared. His stomach clenched. Yet beneath the fear pulsed something quieter, a yearning as deep as the roots of the ancient pine outside. Mastery, peace. The words glowed like embers in the night. He inhaled, slow and deliberate, the bitter tang of tea still on his tongue from the evening ritual. The bitterness grounded him, just as the seiza posture anchored his body to the earth. The lantern flickered. A shadow danced across the Kamidana shrine in the corner, brushing the offerings of rice and sake laid for the ancestors. Were they watching, judging? He straightened his spine, feeling the stretch of muscle woven tight with tension. A bead of sweat traced his temple not from exertion, but from the silent battle within. Honor is not given, his swordmaster had said. It is forged in the stillness between breaths. He clung to those words now, letting the katana's chill seep into his skin, a counterpoint to the heat of his racing thoughts. Beyond the dojo, the night deepened. A temple bell tolled once, its resonance thrumming through the air like a plucked string, marking the hour when spirits walked and men confronted their truths. The sound wrapped around him, steady as a heartbeat, and for a breath, just one, his mind stilled. The blade in his hands was no longer a burden, but an extension of his will. The same way the moon belonged to the sky or the river to its course. His shoulders relaxed. The petals against the shoji rustled again, and this time he imagined them falling not as warnings but as blessings, fragile yet fearless in their surrender. Perhaps honor was not a thing to carry, he thought, but a path to walk, step by step, breath by breath. With a final sigh, he sheathed the katana. The click of the guard meeting the scabbard was softer now, certain. The lantern's glow warmed his cheeks as dawn's first light tinged the horizon, not an ending, but a promise. Somewhere in the distance, a bird greeted the rising sun, its song threading through the cobbled streets, through the dojo's weathered beams, through the quiet spaces between his ribs. The ancestors' voices, if they spoke at all, were gentle. He bowed low, forehead touching the tatami, and smiled into the darkness. For the first time in months, his chest did not ache. The path ahead was long, but his feet, like the blossoms outside, knew the way. Takeshi lay upon the tatami, the crisp, grassy scent of fresh straw mingling with the faint aroma of green tea lingering in the air. A bitter trace on his tongue from the evening ceremony. The shoji screens glowed softly with the moon's pallid light, casting narrow shadows that stretched like blades across the floor. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of a night watchman's geta echoed against cobbled streets, a steady heartbeat of the sleepless city beyond the walls. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his body sinking into the firm mat, his fingers tracing the smooth silk of his futon cover cool, deliberate, like the polished hilt of his katana. His muscles ached from the day's training, yet his mind still hummed with the sharp, whispering slide of steel drawn from its saya. That fleeting sound between stillness and motion, between doubt and certainty. He had faltered during practice, his grip tightening just a fraction too late, his stance wavering beneath his master's scrutiny. The disappointment in Lord Kuroda's eyes had been slight, almost imperceptible, but Takeshi had felt it like a cut shallow but stinging. His chest tightened, and for a breath, he was a boy again, watching his father's back as the man knelt before their ancestral shrine, shoulders rigid with expectation. A samurai does not hesitate, the old man had said, voice colder than winter stone. To doubt is to dishonor. The memory coiled around him, heavy as armor. Yet beneath it, there was something else, the stillness he had found afterward, alone in the dojo's dim silence, the way his breath had steadied when he closed his eyes and let the world fall away. It was there, in the space between heartbeats, that he touched something deeper than skill or duty. the quiet certainty of river stones, of temple bells ringing across centuries, of the first cherry blossoms clinging to branches before their inevitable fall. He flexed his fingers, watching the pale moonlight shimmer along the calluses, proof of labor, of devotion. The path before him was long, uneven, but tonight the weight felt lighter. The cicadas' drone outside wove into the whisper of wind through bamboo, a lullaby of the earth's endless turning. He smiled, small but sure, and let sleep pull him under, carrying him like a leaf upon a stream. One more step taken, one more breath along the way,